So, 500K managed identities in this global enterprise, worldwide offices, huge organization. There's actually 140,000 employees, and I mentioned identities is more than carbon life forms, right? 140,000 employees, 500K identities. That gives you an idea of how big and how robust the identity architecture is. It's much bigger than just the 140K. I'm going to name some specific name technologies. In many cases, there are alternatives. I'm just talking about a case study, so you're going to see specific name brands here. Those name brands aren't affiliated with this conference. They don't know I'm here talking about them. This just happens to be, the shop I wanted to analyze and sort of deconstruct. But at the fundamental heart of all this, there's device trustworthiness, there's path trustworthiness, there's constant and possibly upscaled opt-in, and there's constant opt-in for inbound and outbound access as well. And again, when we talk about trustworthiness, and we talk about device and we talk about path, we're back to here. Path, device, application, data, this is the stuff that we're protecting. And you'll hear me reference this at every iteration. So here's the eye candy slide slash eye chart slide. This is the core of the architecture. So what we have is an environment that has an EDR. They've got a secure configuration management platform. They've got a SASE, CASB, DLP type solution, right? And they've got a SIEM and an XDR that are managing and monitoring all of that. And at the core of it, in the center of it, is the identity proposition, right? The whole principle is, for any given one of these tech stack positions, there's a direct tie-in with a feedback loop back to identity. And we can start with EDR. In this case, this particular company is using CrowdStrike. It tracks machine identity. It tracks in machine behaviors, both usual and unusual, right? CrowdStrike is not just going to throw a block on a bad thing. It may throw an alert. It may throw a note. It may say, hey, this is fishy. Not fishy enough to auto-block, but fishy enough that I should send something upstream to note that something weird has happened, right? So the question with CrowdStrike is, what do you usually come from? What device are you usually on, right? It's a device-centric perspective. And they've got this tool called DTA, device level trustworthiness. They basically are assessing on a constant basis the health of the device and looking at all of that, right? Well, let's say CrowdStrike finds something truly bad. Just instantly finds something truly bad on the device. CrowdStrike's going to shut it down. CrowdStrike's going to throw a note to the SIEM, hey, by the way, found the thing, shut it down. You don't really need much more than that. But again, this conversation is about context, identity in the context of context. And there's subtlety to context. If it's not something that CrowdStrike automatically blocks, but is rather a bit worried about, what is it supposed to do? Just throw a note to the SIEM and hope somebody sees that, right? That's not good enough. So it literally goes straight to Okta. And it says to Okta, I saw something a little fishy. Do something about that. And Okta can force a reauthentication. Okta can pop up right there at that moment of access and say, oh, you're trying to do such and such on this device. I need you to reauthenticate. Pull out your authenticator app and reauthenticate. Right? That's one option Okta can do. Another option is Okta can shut you down on the login side, because Okta controls access, the identity logins. It can force an MFA scenario, it can force an SSO scenario, it can reforce an authentication mechanism. It can upscale authentication. Let's imagine Grant is logged in on his device and he travels to your business takes you to Russia tomorrow. And you're in Russia and suddenly your device reports something freaky. We have context. We have context that he's in Russia. We have context that something's changed on his box. And we know he's in Russia. And we validate all that piece. So we're a little bit worried. So we say, you know what? Fingerprint swipe. We've got Windows Hello on these endpoints, right? Swipe your fingerprint. Let's see that you're really Grant and not the Russians who just stole Grant's computer and ran down the alley. Pretty straightforward, right? But it's a context trigger.
Can you use a mic, use the hand?
Am I quiet back there?
Yeah, just so he can hear the recording.
All right.
Testing. We're there? Okay, big booming boys.
I'll sing some Barry White when we're done. So the device is now suspect. And CrowdStrike throws an alert that something is suspect, and Okta forces a re-identification and forces even an upscale on identification. You've gone from I logged in once at the beginning of this process to now I'm doing a fingerprint swipe and revalidating who I am. And if Okta is unsuccessful, if that revalidation attempt is unsuccessful, Okta sends back to CrowdStrike, CrowdStrike shuts it down. It's a closed loop, right? So that's kind of the opening theory of this model, and you'll see that this works with absolutely every piece of the architecture. So let's look at secure configuration management, Tanium. How many of you guys are familiar with tools in that genre, Tanium? Like it's not, okay, so briefly for those who didn't raise their hands, you're talking about how you actually control the health of the box is the best way to look at it. That's how I describe secure config management. Every box should be patched to this level. Every box should be configured in the following way. Every browser should be loaded in the following way with the following configs. And you've got this thing blocked and that thing enabled. And it's kind of your defined state of what you want your endpoints to be. Tanium is a tool that will push that, validate that, look at that. And again, something changes, right? Tanium sees config has changed. Or the patch we were supposed to have, we don't have for some reason. And I'm pushing the patch and it's being rejected. And it's being rejected in a funny way. Again, Tanium has its default, okay, shut it down moment, right? But again, context is key. So what does Tanium say? Tanium says, well, it's fishy. Not fishy enough to shut it down, but fishy enough I should check in, right? Let's go back to Okta and let's have Okta do something about it, right? Okta can kick you off that device. Okta can kick you off that, it can re-authenticate, it can force a fingerprint swipe. We're back to the same scenario we had with CrowdStrike. So something funny happens with your config baseline, you can do something about it at the identity level, right? Same thing with the health of the box. Health of the box and now malicious activity against. So the same scenario. Now we get into Zscaler, SASE and CASB. They've got their ZIA, ZPA, ZTE. They've got everything starts with Z over there. A whole bunch of different technologies that are basically a near continuous auth Z. They lock IP to IP traffic. They block suspect source and desk. They feed the SIM and the XDR. And now we're asking context questions like, does this user normally exit our shop and go to this particular cloud app? We've got some cloud apps that we subscribe to as a company. Whatever, Workday, pick something simple. Does this user normally access Workday? No. Why is this user suddenly accessing Workday, and why have they tried to authenticate 3 times against Workday? Hey, Okta, shut them down, right? We've got 2 applications in the server room that talk to each other on a constant basis, and one day one of them's trying to talk to another one, right? That might be something actually that the SIM catches, but that's in some cases something Zscaler can catch. But the basic idea is flow of traffic. This is back to on the network slide, right? on the source slide, this is the first pillar. We're now in the network environment. Zscaler is all about monitoring and managing that network and environment, right? So anything fishy that Zscaler finds, it can go back to Okta, and it can say shut them down, kick them out, expire their token. It can say have them re-authenticate. It can have them upscale authentication, right? It's the exact same story again. And every one of these activities from all 3 of these is not just talking to Okta, but they're also feeding the SIM and the XDR. In this case, these guys were using Exabeam, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with Exabeam, but it's one of the more modern SIMs that allows you to, I don't know how fully and completely the claim is true, but the gist of it is you can do away with tier 1 and maybe even part of your tier 2 SOC analyst function and literally have the AI and ML and all that good jazz in there taking care of that piece for you. Take that with a grain of salt, as we all do whenever any vendor says AI. But the basic premise is a lot of this stuff is automatable, and a lot of this stuff can be screened and scanned. And in this particular architecture, all those scenarios I described are ones that this sucker can handle and deal with without a human being even having to get in the loop, right? That's the beauty of this architecture. And again, guess what? Talks to Okta directly. So if the SIM finds an alert, let's say that something barely fishy from CrowdStrike hits, and that's mixed with something barely fishy from Tanium, which is mixed with something barely fishy from Zscaler. This tool can put all those 3 barely's together and say, that adds up to a barely, let's trigger Okta and let's do the thing. So once again, context is key. In this case, it's not just about network movement, it's not just about device health, it's not just about device intrusion. It could be about any combination of those. Yeah?
So we don't use Okta, so I'm ignorant on this, but my question is, if you have a Windows environment, you have Active Directory, does Okta replace the authentication when you log into your machine from Active Directory?
So
you said it's authoritative, but is really AD more authoritative than Okta, except for web-based authentications?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And I'm glad you asked it, especially here at a Microsoft-sponsored conference. We'll talk about that a little bit. I have worked in shops where Okta laid on top of AD and was basically the SSO interface and the MFA and sat on top of AD. I have worked in shops where Okta was the core of it all. In this particular architecture, AD is still there, but AD is no longer underneath Okta. AD is off to the side managing the handful of things they haven't gotten into Okta yet. So this is an almost AD displacement shop in this particular case, but it doesn't have to be to do a bunch of this stuff.
Does that include logging into the endpoint?
So when you log into the endpoint, it still looks like and feels like Windows, but as soon as you touch anything else, it's Okta.
Okay, but logging into the endpoint
Is still
just
AD. Is still AD.
Okay.
Yep, it's still
Just
AD.
double check.
In this particular environment, yeah, but it can vary, and I believe they've gotten it to the point now where you can log in straight to Okta.
We
Okay.
do this as well. So we had a massive battle. So like, do you think it's like who's going to be the source of truth? Is it off there or is it AD?
Yeah.
Well, I hear it all the time, like, oh, it's not AD, but then you're like, well, is when you log into Microsoft Windows, is it really Okta or is it AD? Because
Right.
my understanding is like, I don't think you're replacing it.
We had Windows Hello on the endpoint.
Yes.
You need to have Windows Hello to get that. It's the bigger base to let you go a certain level of maturity right with the
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Generally, when Okta enters the shop, it sits parallel first. To go all the way to this level is a pretty extreme Okta-centric architecture. That's it's not very common. What's that?
Can we shut AD down then in this scenario?
In theory, they can. At this point, they can. And I don't know if you guys have ever used Jump Cloud. It's kind of I call it poor man's Okta. I've used it in a lot of smaller shops. Jump Cloud, you're authenticating directly into Jump Cloud on your Windows box. I mean, you still have it. It looks like and feels like a Windows login, but your Windows login is controlled by Jump Cloud, and it's all Jump Cloud on the back end. And Okta can do the same. So you can intercept at the point of login. It still looks like the same Windows prompt, but it's actually something else on the back end. So you can go that far if you want to.
Does that include the computer itself? Is that there's no more like domain joined?
You can go completely without AD domains if you want to, but again, how viable is that really? How mature does your Okta-centric view have to be, and how much AD legacy debt do you have? Like, I'm not advocating replacing AD. In this particular shop, they did it. Some of these technologies we're describing and some of these interactions we're describing are viable in AD, by the way. Like this is just one case study of one shop that's really Okta-centric. And they've got their AD crammed into a corner at this point, and that's it. But it took them years and years and years to get there, and forever the Okta laid with AD, and AD was still the source of truth. Now Okta is the source of truth in this shop. But you know, your mileage may vary, your journey will vary, and you don't have to be that Okta-centric. What do you got?
Alan, a question about the actions that you're taking. So far, you've really only mentioned one, maybe two, like account lock and then machine lock. Are there other like levels or stages of actions in this particular?
Yeah. And all three of these tools in the tech stack, you know, ignore this guy. He's mostly just a monitor and reporter, right? But he can trigger these guys to act. So the actors are these three. All three of them offer the same actions they've always offered. CrowdStrike can kill the app, can kill the box, can shut you down, can kick you out, can turn off and disable hardware components.
I know it can for sure with like analyst or operator interaction.
Yeah.
I'm curious about some of the predefined decisions that are more automated. Like, did you all only enable some automated actions with a kind of minimum set, and then at that point it goes to operator decision making?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's the same way this guy is tiered out, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a certain amount of automation for your tier 1 or tier 2 behaviors. You can tell CrowdStrike, kill the port. Just kill it when you see such and such activity. Just do it. I don't even want to hear about it. Tell the SIM after the fact you did it. And I've had plenty of users call and complain about I was trying to do X, Y, and Z and suddenly bam. Yeah, so all these tools are still capable of doing the bam on their own. But the idea is in a contextual architecture with identity at the core, in most cases, kicking somebody out or forcing them to re-authenticate, or even better yet, forcing them to do a biometric, back to your joke at the beginning, Phil, of, like how do we all get into this conference, right? Everyone presented a photo ID, right, downstairs, and then we were issued a token, and then we transported that token with an unsecure protocol upstairs and got a badge, right? So, it's that same model. Somebody can screw with it at the identity level and get away with all kinds of things, and that's why we put identity at the core. So every one of these tools is still capable of the automated shutdown. Zscaler can kill a connection. Tanium can kill a device. CrowdStrike can kill a port, kill an app, kill a device. All those capabilities are still there. But the idea is if they're all talking together with the identity at the core and feeding the SIM, who also has that same integration with the identity, now we've got every bit of context we ever want for everything. And every action we take, we know what we took and we know why we took it. And if we choose to, we can take the action at the identity level. That's kind of the gist of the whole architecture, right? This was 140,000 employees. Like, this was impressive. These guys took years to pull this off, but pretty cool. Yeah.
Where is third-party risk in this? If I'm transferring my data to move it, where's the telemetry that says, oh, move it? Which
Yeah, so
that third party is not safe.
you get DLP capabilities off of CrowdStrike from the physical ports, right? So what are you doing to your USB? CrowdStrike can talk to that. So that's part of the answer. Zscaler is a huge part of that as well. You can get to the point where you throttle back on what's even allowed to be connected to at all, cloud-wise. How do you get out of the shop? How do you do the things? Zscaler is an agent-based solution. So there's an agent on the laptop. You can do some manipulations as to what you're allowed to access out there. And you can do a certain amount of filtering. And again, this little guy is keeping an eye on things too. So there's a certain amount of that to it. But third party is not necessarily what you're trying to address with this architecture. There's some adjunct capability there. There's some adjunct DLP here. Like you notice I mentioned CASB and SASE for Zscaler alone. There's some real DLP capability there as well, right? But that's, to me, more adjunct. I tend to think of third party as being much more in the governance and risk and management and risk management and compliance space than I do in the tech stack space still to date. And that's a whole other conversation. I would love to have a third party risk conference like this one and dive into those architectures, because there's some stuff, some people are doing this very clever, and there's some stuff that just pisses me off in third party. But that's a whole other conversation. Let's see, what else did I have here? Yeah, so, there's actual, I stole these straight off the, I think it was the Okta website where all these came from. Talking about specifically how do we interact with CrowdStrike and what's our flow like. This was, I was just cheating. I was going to do workflow diagrams, and I realized I could just steal from a website, so I did. The device is sketchy, back to auth-n, right? Or better yet, upgrade it. This is the gist of it. This is how they interoperate with CrowdStrike. And feel free to, all right. Same story with Zscaler. And you notice even the iconography and the workflows and the story they put on their website is almost identical. And the whole idea is, again, it's all about context, and it's all about identity as the core to control and disrupt the bad thing, if that's in fact what you're picking up contextually is the bad thing, right? And again, same thing. Here we are talking to the SIM. In this case, it's Exabeam. And again, they've announced a real deep partnership. The Tanium partnership is interesting. There's a little bit less actual workflow there from what I can tell, and a little bit less interoperability. That full dialogue we described is less in place with Tanium than it is with CrowdStrike. But then again, mechanically, there's less concern there on a config level versus CrowdStrike is already doing a whole lot of those things anyway. It looks like it's more of a, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the phrase Barney relationship. When two companies put out a press release, I love you, you love me. But, there's maybe not necessarily a whole lot of meat to it. The Tanium one has some meat to it, but maybe not as much as these other three, so I didn't bother including that on its slide. But, shout out to Microsoft. I mentioned before, I'm talking about Okta here. Windows Hello is absolutely integral to this architecture, absolutely integral. If you guys have got fingerprint swipers, biometrics, Retina, whatever shenanigans you want to do with Hello, pins, any other extra stuff above and beyond the standard identity and access, Okta can trigger that and force the event to happen through Windows Hello. So the fingerprint swipe, for example, is there. The local pin on the box separate from the password is there. Whatever options Windows Hello gives you, Okta can trigger and force all that when you talk about the upscaling of identity. So shout out to Windows Hello. It's a fine solution. And so probably the single biggest takeaway for this whole model, we asked about source of truth. Is it AD or is it Okta? The bottom line is, the CISO's team is now the source of truth, not HR, right? HR is literally getting identity from you, not the other way around. This is how it should be. And then my joke is, do you know you're good? Because that's who you really are. Of course, that's not who you really are, but that's just me being fun. And that's it, guys. Any further questions? Yeah, so the question there was, do I consider Zero Trust to be centered around identity or around architecture? Because obviously this is a very identity-centric presentation, and we're at an identity conference. I chose to dive in on identity. My take on Zero Trust is it has to be all of the above. Architecture is key. Architecture is part of it. Not shown in this presentation at all, for example, would be microsegmentation. There's a lot of other things you have to do in a true Zero Trust architecture beyond this. But if you just go with this identity-centric approach and start with the endpoints, start with the application, start with the cloud contact, your Zscaler, your Tanium, your CrowdStrike, your Exabeam, you're already nailing 90% of your Zero Trust story. Because what's left is a little bit of, you got microsegmentation, you got some application stuff that you got to deal with.
You've got traditional firewalling and some other things there. And then, you know, what we didn't get into was Zscaler used to get into the shop, not just out. We didn't even talk about that scenario. It's a replacement essentially for VPN because you zero trust access to all your internal stuff where you have to come through Zscaler, you have to come through Okta. Even if you're on site, you're still authenticating to get to the SSO clicky, to get to the application in-house or the cloud app, whichever one it might be. You're basically treating everyone on site as if they're off site. There's no difference anymore, right? This particular shop already had all of that in place before they dove deep in this identity piece. And when COVID hit, it was insane. Everybody's freaking out. Everybody's like, oh my God, COVID, we're scattering the workforce to the four winds. And they reached out to the CISO and said, what are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? Oh, I was going to pick up the phone and see if the CIO needed any help. We've already got zero trust. There's no difference. We were already prepped and prepared and set up to work from anywhere, truly work from anywhere. And that's integral as well. So that's it, folks.